If you drive into Wisconsin Dells today from the south, along the Parkway that locals still call the Strip, there is a log cabin McDonald's on the corner where Broadway meets the highway. It is large and conspicuous, built in 2002 with thick timbers that give it the look of something from the frontier, though of course it sells Big Macs and McFlurries like every other McDonald's in America. Next door stands a Walgreens. Across the parking lot, a Starbucks. The whole arrangement is perfectly ordinary, the kind of commercial intersection that exists in 10,000 small towns across the country. But that McDonald's was built to look like a log cabin for a reason. The ground beneath it, and beneath the Walgreens, and beneath the parking lot where tourists idle in their minivans wondering where to eat, all of it once belonged to a place called Fort Dells. And the story of Fort Dells, if you follow it all the way through, tells you something about Wisconsin Dells that the water parks and go-kart tracks can't. It tells you what the place was before it became what it is now, and why that change happened the way it did. Fort Dells was an 11-acre amusement park modeled on Disneyland's Frontierland. It opened in June of 1959 and closed after the 1985 season. For 26 years, it was the anchor attraction of the entire Dells tourist corridor, second in popularity only to the famous duckboat tours that had been running since 1946. At its peak in 1972, Fort Dells drew more than 250,000 visitors in a single season. That is a remarkable number for a park that fit on 11 acres, in a town that was not yet the indoor water park capital of anything. To understand how it got there, and why it didn't stay, requires going back to a particular autumn, a particular Wisconsin winter, and a group of people with an idea borrowed from Southern California. The foundations for Fort Dells were laid in the fall of 1958. Disneyland had opened 3 years earlier in 1955, and its influence was radiating outward across the country. Walt Disney had shown that a themed amusement park, organized around stories rather than just rides, could draw enormous crowds and generate fierce loyalty. Frontierland, with its stagecoaches and steam trains and frontier stockade, was one of the original 4 themed lands. By the late 50s, entrepreneurs in tourist towns everywhere were studying what Disney had done and asking how much of it they could reproduce on a smaller scale with local materials at a fraction of the cost. Wisconsin Dells was already a busy summer destination. Tourists had been coming to see the sandstone gorges of the Wisconsin River since the 19th century, drawn first by the photographs of H. Bennett, whose stop-action images of the rock formations helped put the Dells on the national map. By the 1950s, the area had accumulated a modest collection of attractions: the duckboat tours, the Tommy Bartlett Water Ski Show on Lake Delton, the Wisconsin Deer Park, and Storybook Gardens, a gentle 10-acre walk-through park of fairy tale figurines that had opened in 1956. But there was nothing with the ambition of a Disneyland-style theme park. Fort Dells was meant to fill that gap. Workers cut logs from the surrounding Wisconsin woods and shaped them through the bitter cold of that winter. Accounts from the period describe construction crews laying timbers in freezing temperatures, building the stockade walls and frontier buildings that would form the park's perimeter. The site itself was well chosen. It sat at the corner of Broadway and what was then U.S. Route 12, later called Wisconsin Dells Parkway, a prime location on the main road that carried tourists between Lake Delton and downtown Wisconsin Dells. Behind the road frontage, the land dropped into the floodplain of Hulbert Creek and backed up against a natural sandstone bluff, the same kind of dramatic rock formation that had drawn tourists to the Dells in the first place. The builders used this topography deliberately. The bluff became a backdrop for the park's frontier town, and the creek provided the water for what would become the steamboat channel. Nature did half the scenic work for free. The remaining construction, the decorating and finishing touches, happened after the snow melted in the spring of 1959. By June, the park was open to the public, with a grand opening celebration following in July. What visitors found when they walked through the gate was something unlike anything else in the Dells, a fully realized frontier town spread across the floodplain of Hulbert Creek, nestled against a sandstone bluff, divided into 4 themed areas. There was Frontierland with its western storefronts and saloon facades. There was Adventureland, There was Indian Isle, and there was the Children's Farm, where smaller visitors could see animals and wander at their own pace. The park used the same land names that Disney did: Frontierland, Adventureland. And by some accounts, Disney allowed this without objection, a detail that seems remarkable today but speaks to a different era of intellectual property enforcement, or perhaps to the fact that Fort Dells was so far from Anaheim that it posed no competitive threat. The attractions that populated Fort Dells in its early years were built around participation and immersion rather than speed or mechanical thrills. The park had a working steam railroad, Engine Number 9, which carried passengers along the margin of the property between the Sandstone Bluff and Hulbert Creek. It had a paddlewheel steamboat called the Robert E. Lee, which floated along a man-made channel that ran parallel to the creek. It had the Dells Fargo stagecoach, which followed its own path alongside the train tracks and the waterway, so that at certain moments all three, the train, the steamboat, and the stagecoach, moved in parallel through the park, each carrying its own cargo of visitors. There was a suspension bridge. There was an escape tunnel. There were blockhouse exhibits that recreated the feel of a frontier outpost. The frontier homestead and schoolhouse let visitors see a version of pioneer domestic life. The Children's Farm offered animals to feed and pet, and running through all of it, binding the separate attractions into something that felt like a living world, were the costumed characters. Actors in frontier clothing roamed the park, stopped to talk with visitors, posed for photographs. The line between audience and performance was kept deliberately thin. Imagine arriving on a July morning in 1963. The parking lot is gravel and dust. The cars are wide and chrome-heavy. The license plates mostly Illinois, some Wisconsin, a few from Iowa or Minnesota. The entrance is a wooden stockade gate built from those same logs cut during the winter of 1958, and passing through it produces an immediate shift in atmosphere. The noise of the highway drops away. The air smells different. Animal, wood smoke, popcorn. Somewhere ahead and to the left, the whistle of Engine Number 9 cuts through the morning. A man in a leather vest and a wide-brimmed hat tips his head and says good morning in a drawl that may or may not be authentic. A child tugs at a parent's sleeve, wanting to go toward the sound of the train. The parent is reading a hand-drawn map that divides the park into its 4 sections. The day has not yet begun, and it already feels like somewhere else. This is what Fort Dells sold, more than any individual ride or show. It sold the feeling of crossing a threshold, and the attraction that sealed that feeling, the one that visitors from those years mentioned first and most often, was the Black Bart holdup. Black Bart was a character borrowed loosely from the real stagecoach robber of 19th century California, Charles Bowles, who held up Wells Fargo stages in the 1870s and 1880s with theatrical courtesy, never robbing passengers, occasionally leaving poems at the scene. The Fort Dells version took the name and the outlaw premise and built it into a recurring live-action show that became the park's signature. Several times a day, Black Bart and his gang would stage a holdup somewhere in the park, sometimes along the railroad tracks as Engine Number 9 slowed for a curve, sometimes at the stagecoach route as the Dells Fargo coach rounded a bend near the frontier storefronts. The sheriff would confront him. Shots would be fired, blanks of course, but loud enough to make children grab for their parents' hands and for birds to scatter from the trees along Hulbert Creek. Visitors standing nearby became involuntary witnesses, bystanders drawn into a drama they had not expected. The chase might move through the park, past storefronts and around corners, down the terrace where the railroad ran. Black Bart would be captured, or he would escape, depending on which performance you happened to catch and what time of day it was. One former employee recalled that the show was timed so that different groups of visitors would encounter it at different points in their visit, giving the whole park a feeling of unpredictable drama. You might be standing in line for the steamboat and hear gunfire from across the property. You might round a corner at the Children's Farm and find the sheriff in pursuit. The effect was to make the park feel alive in a way that static exhibits and mechanical rides could not achieve. What made it work was the scale. 11 acres is not large. Disneyland, by comparison, covered more than 60 acres when it opened, but the intimacy of Fort Dells was part of its appeal. The actors were close enough to touch. The train moved slowly enough that you could watch the landscape change. The Robert E. Lee steamboat did not travel far, but the channel it floated on was bordered by real sandstone and real trees, and the illusion of being somewhere remote, somewhere historical, was easier to maintain in a small space than it would have been in a large one. The park understood that its audience was not looking for the scale of Disneyland. It was looking for a version of Disneyland that felt accessible, manageable, reachable, something a family from Chicago or Milwaukee or Rockford could drive to on a Saturday morning and experience in full by late afternoon. For the first several years, Fort Dells operated as what one historian of roadside attractions has called a passive park, a place organized around strolling, seeing, and learning, with live performances as the main draw. The rides, such as they were, moved slowly and served the theme. The stagecoach was not a thrill ride. The train was not fast. The steamboat was a gentle float. Even the escape tunnel and the suspension bridge were more about atmosphere than adrenaline. This made Fort Dells part of a specific moment in American tourism, one that was already passing even as the park reached its prime. In the 1950s and early 1960s, family attractions across the country were built on this model. Storybook Gardens down the road, Biblical Gardens, which opened nearby in 1962, the Enchanted Forest, Prehistoric Land, Pioneer Village. They were places designed for the pace of walking, the rhythm of looking, the pleasure of being somewhere that felt different from home. They did not compete on speed or intensity. They competed on charm. But Fort Dells had one advantage over its neighbors, and it arrived on June 1st, 1966, the Totem Tower. The Totem Tower was a rotating observation gondola that stood 335 feet tall. When it opened that day, 60 eager riders climbed into the gondola for its first ascent. It was the fourth ride of its kind in the United States, and only the seventh in the world. From the top, visitors could see what seemed like an endless expanse of Wisconsin, the river gorges, the forest canopy, the patchwork of farms and roads extending to the horizon. The tower dwarfed everything else in the Dells. It was visible for miles, rising above the tree line like an antenna, a landmark that announced Fort Dells to anyone approaching from any direction. Visitors from those years often mention the Totem Tower before they mention anything else about the park, even before Black Bart, because the view from the top was the kind of experience that rearranged your sense of where you were. From ground level, the Dells was a busy strip of motels and souvenir shops and competing attractions. From 335 feet, it was a landscape. The Totem Tower changed what Fort Dells was. Until 1966, the park had been a walk-through attraction with live shows and gentle rides. After 1966, it had a genuine landmark, a reason to visit that went beyond the frontier theme. The tower also signaled ambition. A park that installs the seventh ride of its kind in the world is not content to remain a passive stroll-and-see operation. It wants to grow. The experience of riding the Totem Tower was itself a kind of narrative. The gondola rose slowly, rotating as it climbed, so that the view changed continuously. At ground level, riders could see the park itself, the roofs of the frontier buildings, the tracks of the railroad, the channel of the Robert E. Lee. As the gondola climbed, the park shrank and the landscape expanded. The motels and souvenir shops of the Strip came into view. Then the river, then the bluffs, then the patchwork of agricultural land stretching south toward Baraboo and the Sauk County farmland. At full height, visitors could see the curvature of the horizon, or at least they believed they could. The descent reversed the process. The world contracted, the park enlarged, and by the time the gondola settled back to earth, the visitor had been given a perspective on where Fort Dells actually was, a small patch of themed ground in an enormous landscape, a frontier town that existed at the precise intersection of fantasy and geography. Those who rode the Totem Tower on clear days sometimes described it as the best view in Wisconsin. The ride cost nothing beyond the park admission. It could accommodate 60 riders per ascent. On busy summer days, the line stretched across the park. A photograph from the era shows the tower rising above the tree line like a needle, visible from every direction, the most prominent man-made object in the entire Dells skyline. It became the way people identified Fort Dells on the drive-in. You'll see the tower was all the directions anyone needed. And for the next several years, Fort Dells did grow, adding attractions that pulled it further from its original character as a pure frontier experience. The gold mine appeared, offering visitors a walk through a cave carved into the sandstone bluff at the edge of the park. This was the Big Bonanza Mine, a fabricated cavern that played on the gold rush mythology of the frontier era, its entrance cut into the same sandstone that had drawn tourists to the Dells for over a century. Inside, there were displays meant to evoke a working mine, along with a bank teller's window that was part of the park's larger narrative about frontier commerce and frontier crime. The same gold that the miners pulled from the earth was the gold that Black Bart tried to steal from the stagecoach. An antique car ride was added, giving visitors a mechanical amusement that had little to do with the Old West, but everything to do with the evolving expectations of park visitors in the late 1960s, when even modest parks were expected to offer at least a few mechanical rides alongside their themed environments. A haunted house went in, a concession to the funhouse scare genre that had been an amusement park staple since Coney Island. Timber Trail offered a nature walk through the woods at the edge of the property, a quiet counterpoint to the noise and activity of the main park areas. Each edition stretched the thematic boundaries a little further, moving Fort Dells from a place that told one coherent story about the frontier to a place that offered many experiences, not all of them related, accumulated over years of incremental expansion. This is the period, the late 1960s into the early 1970s, when Fort Dells reached its peak. The park drew its record attendance of more than 250,000 visitors in 1972. To put that number in context, the entire population of the city of Wisconsin Dells at the time was only a few thousand people. The park was pulling visitors not just from Wisconsin but from across the upper Midwest, particularly from Illinois, where a family trip to the Dells was becoming something close to a rite of passage. The drive from Chicago was about 3 hours, from Milwaukee less than 2. These were families with station wagons and coolers, families that budgeted their summers around a week or a long weekend at the Dells and expected to fill their days with attractions. Fort Dells was typically near the top of the list, right after the Ducks. The summer of 1972 itself is worth pausing on because it captures the park at its fullest expression. By that year, the Tommy Bartlett Water Ski Show had been running on Lake Delton for 2 decades and had become one of the most popular ski shows in the country. The Ducks were carrying capacity loads through the sandstone gorges every day of the peak season. Storybook Gardens was still drawing families with small children. The Wisconsin Deer Park, opened since 1952, was a reliable stop. The Strip was lined with motels that filled up every Friday through Sunday from Memorial Day to Labor Day, places with names like the Riviera, the Flamingo, the Copacabana, names borrowed from more glamorous destinations and applied to modest motor courts with neon signs and kidney-shaped pools. The whole area operated on a simple economic logic. Families came for the scenery, stayed for the attractions, and spent money at every point along the way. Fort Dells, with its combination of rides, live shows, and interactive characters, was a full-day attraction in a market where many of the other options took only an hour or 2. A family could arrive in the morning, eat lunch at the park, watch 2 or 3 Black Bart performances, ride the train and the steamboat, visit the children's farm, take the Totem Tower to the top, and still find things to do in the afternoon. That kind of holding power was rare, and it made the park valuable not just to its own operators, but to the entire Dells economy. But something was happening in 1972 that would not become obvious for another decade. The peak, as it turned out, was also the beginning of the turn. The frontier myth that powered Fort Dells was losing its cultural grip. In the 1950s, when the park was conceived, Westerns dominated American television and film. Gunsmoke premiered in 1955, the same year Disneyland opened. Bonanza, Have Gun Will Travel, The Rifleman, Wagon Train. At one point in the late 1950s, more than 30 Western series were airing on American television simultaneously. A child growing up in that era absorbed the imagery of the frontier as naturally as breathing. Cowboys and Indians was a game played in every backyard. The cap gun was a standard birthday present. The mythology of the West? Lawmen and outlaws, stagecoaches and gold, the open range, the frontier fort, was not just entertainment but a shared language, a set of images and stories that everyone understood without having to be taught. Fort Dells spoke that language fluently. When Black Bart stepped out of the saloon doors with his hat pulled low, every child in the audience already knew the story they were about to see because they had seen a version of it on television every night that week. By the early 1970s, the Western genre was in steep decline on television. The last of the great Western series were ending their runs or had already been canceled. The counterculture had complicated the narrative of frontier heroism. Films like Little Big Man, released in 1970, and Soldier Blue the same year, were presenting the West in darker, more ambivalent terms. The simple story of sheriffs and outlaws, of stagecoach robberies and gold mines, was becoming harder to sell as innocent entertainment. Children born in the 1970s did not grow up watching Westerns. They grew up watching science fiction. Star Wars came out in 1977, and action shows and sitcoms set in contemporary suburbs. The frontier was no longer the default setting of the American imagination. Fort Dells did not change its story. It kept staging the Black Bart holdup. It kept running engine number 9 along the tracks by the bluff. The costumed characters kept wearing their frontier clothing. But the cultural wind that had filled its sails was shifting, and the park could feel it in ways that were subtle at first and then increasingly unmistakable. Fewer children recognized the character types. Fewer families responded to the frontier theme with the automatic enthusiasm it had once generated, and more visitors treated the park as a quaint curiosity rather than an exciting destination. Meanwhile, a different kind of attraction was beginning to take shape along the very same stretch of highway. The first major waterslides appeared in the Dells area in the 1970s. They were simple by later standards: fiberglass troughs with running water, plunging riders into pools at the bottom. But they introduced a fundamentally different relationship between the visitor and the attraction. At Fort Dells, the visitor was an observer, an audience member, someone who watched Black Bart get captured or looked out from the Totem Tower or sat in the steamboat while the scenery drifted past. At a waterslide, the visitor was the attraction. The sensation was in the body, not the imagination. It was immediate, visceral, and, this mattered enormously, repeatable. A child who went down a waterslide wanted to climb back up and go down again, and again, and again. A child who watched the Black Bart holdup had seen a good show, but seeing it a second time the same day was not the same experience. The implications of this difference would take a decade to play out fully, but they were already visible to anyone paying attention. In 1979, a family named Waterman purchased a piece of frontage property on U.S. Route 12 in the Dells and created a bumper boat ride and a go-kart track on the site of what had been the Delton Outdoor Theater, the area's drive-in movie theater. That drive-in closing and a water attraction opening in its place was a small event, but symbolically it was precise, one form of passive sit-and-watch entertainment giving way to another that was physical and participatory. The Watermans called their new operation Noah's Incredible Adventure. It would eventually become Noah's Ark, which today bills itself as the largest outdoor water park in America, spread across 70 acres. But in 1979, it was just a small collection of water amusements, the seed of something that nobody yet understood would reshape the entire economy of Wisconsin Dells. Fort Dells could not have anticipated this shift, or at least could not have adapted to it easily. The park's physical infrastructure, the log buildings, the train tracks, the man-made channel for the Robert E. Lee, was designed for a specific kind of experience and could not simply be converted to accommodate water slides. The 11 acres that had felt sufficient for a walk-through park were far too small for the sprawling water attractions that were beginning to appear along the Strip. And the park's identity was so thoroughly tied to the frontier theme that pivoting away from it would have meant becoming something entirely different. Other parks in other places attempted similar pivots during this period, adding water features or thrill rides to themed attractions, usually with mixed results. The problem was not just financial, it was philosophical. You cannot be both a frontier town and a water park. The two experiences contradict each other at every level: aesthetics, sound, pace, the relationship between the visitor and the space. There is a question about Fort Dells that sources do not clearly answer, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The park's ownership and management during the years of decline are not well documented in the publicly available record. The names of the people who built the park in 1958 and 1959, the individuals who decided to install the Totem Tower, the managers who presided over the peak years, these figures are largely absent from the accounts that survive. This is unusual. Most amusement parks of this era have at least one name attached to them, a founder whose biography becomes part of the story. The Ducks had Mel Flath. Storybook Gardens had Flath as well. The Tommy Bartlett Show carried Bartlett's name in the title. Even the Big Chief go-kart operation was inseparable from the Lascaris family story. Fort Dells seems to exist in the public memory as a place without a proprietor, a park that simply appeared and then eventually simply went away. Whether this is because the ownership structure was complicated, or because the operators preferred anonymity, or simply because not enough people thought to record it at the time, is unclear. The 2003 historical marker was erected by the Friends of Fort Dells, a group whose members cared enough about the park to memorialize it, but even they did not include the names of owners or builders on the marker. It leaves a gap in the story that the remaining facts can only partially fill. It is possible, of course, that the information exists somewhere, in county records, in old newspaper files, in the memories of people who worked there, and simply has not been compiled and published. Small amusement parks did not generate the kind of institutional documentation that larger operations did. They were often run as family businesses or small partnerships, and when they closed, their records went into boxes in basements, or were discarded, or simply were never created in the first place. The oral history of Fort Dells is robust. Visitors remember it vividly, but the business history is thin. This creates an odd situation in which we know exactly what the park felt like to visit, but very little about who made it run. What is clear is that the late 1970s and early 1980s were difficult years. The Totem Tower, once the park's greatest asset, had become a maintenance burden. A structure that tall, exposed to Wisconsin weather year after year, required constant attention. Former visitors recall that rides and features were gradually removed or allowed to deteriorate. The costumed characters that had once roamed freely through the park grew fewer. The live shows became less frequent. The impression left by visitor accounts from this period is of a place that was still open, still functioning, but running on less staff, less upkeep, less energy. One former employee recalled that by the early 1980s, certain areas of the park felt noticeably worn, the paint fading on buildings, the landscaping less carefully tended. At the same time, the competition was accelerating. Noah's Ark was expanding rapidly. Go-kart tracks were multiplying along the Strip. A Greek immigrant family named Lascaris, who had arrived in Wisconsin Dells in 1970 to open a hot dog stand, were building what would eventually become the largest go-kart operation in the area, and later the Mount Olympus Water and Theme Park. By 1985, the Lascaris family had torn down their original hot dog stand and built a 4-level go-kart track, the biggest in Wisconsin Dells. The Dells was reinventing itself at speed, and the new attractions were louder, faster, and wetter than anything Fort Dells could offer. Fort Dells closed after the 1985 season. The immediate cause was straightforward. Increasing competition and the pressure of the new waterparks made it impossible to sustain the attendance numbers the park needed to survive. But there was no single catastrophic event, no fire or flood or lawsuit. The park did not close because something went wrong on a particular day. It closed because something had been going wrong gradually, invisibly across a series of seasons during which each individual year's decline seemed manageable, seemed like a dip rather than a trend, seemed like something that could be reversed with one good summer. But the good summer never came. A few specific signs of that decline survive in the accounts of visitors and employees from the final years. The antique car ride was removed at some point during the early 1980s, though the exact year is not clearly recorded. The amphitheater, which had hosted live performances throughout the park's golden years, saw fewer and fewer shows scheduled. One visitor recalled arriving on a weekday in 1984 and being struck by how quiet the park felt. Not empty exactly, but underpopulated, as if the space had been designed for twice as many people as were actually there. The costumed characters still appeared, but there were fewer of them, and they seemed to concentrate in the areas closest to the entrance, leaving the farther reaches of the park, Indian Isle, the back trails, with a sense of abandonment that was at odds with the park's frontier vitality theme. The Black Bart holdup continued to run throughout the park's final seasons. Whatever else was being cut, the signature show remained. But one former employee recalled that the performances became less elaborate as the years went on. The cast shrank. The number of daily shows was reduced. The chase sequences that had once ranged through multiple sections of the park were shortened, confined to a smaller area near the railroad tracks. The show that had once felt like an event woven into the fabric of an entire experience became, by the end, a scheduled performance in a designated spot. Still entertaining, still loud, still capable of making a child jump, but no longer the immersive, park-wide spectacle it had been at its peak. But closure did not mean demolition, not yet. Someone, and again the record is frustratingly vague about exactly who, decided to try to save the property by reinventing it. The park reopened as Dell's Crossroads, a retooled attraction that dropped the frontier theme and replaced it with circus acts. The reasoning was apparently that live entertainment could still draw visitors if the specific theme changed. Circus performances, the thinking went, had broader appeal than Old West shows in an era when the Old West no longer captured the public imagination. There was precedent for this kind of reinvention at other struggling parks around the country, and there was at least some logic to it. The Dells had always been a town that valued entertainment, and circus acts had a built-in audience. Dell's Crossroads failed. The circus format could not overcome the fundamental problem, which was that the site was too small, the infrastructure too old, and the audience too distracted by the water parks erupting all around it. Visitors noted that the Circus World Museum in nearby Baraboo, a much larger and more established circus attraction housed at the original winter quarters of the Ringling Brothers Circus, made Dell's Crossroads feel redundant. If you wanted circus acts in south-central Wisconsin, you went to Baraboo, where the history was real and the scale was appropriate. You did not go to a repurposed frontier park on the Strip. The park closed for good in 1990, just 5 years after the rebranding. The span between 1985 and 1990 is the most obscure period in the Fort Dells story. Very little documentation survives from the Dells Crossroads years. No attendance figures have been published. No detailed accounts of the circus programming have surfaced in the public record. It is as if the park, having lost the identity that made it meaningful, also lost the capacity to generate the kind of memories that people carry forward and share. Fort Dells produced decades of vivid recollections. Dells Crossroads seems to have produced almost none. And then, for 7 years, the structures sat. The log buildings that had been cut from Wisconsin woods in the winter of 1958 and 1959 stood empty through 7 cycles of snow and thaw. The train tracks rusted. The channel that had carried the Robert E. Lee slowly silted in. The big Bonanza mine went dark. Visitors driving past on the Parkway could see the abandoned buildings from the road, gradually being overtaken by honeysuckle and birch saplings. It was an unusual and somewhat unsettling sight in a town that was otherwise booming with construction and expansion. By the early 1990s, Wisconsin Dells was transforming into the water park capital of the world. The transformation happened with startling speed. In 1989, Stan Anderson, owner of the Polynesian Resort Hotel, put a roof over a water attraction at his property and created what is generally credited as the first indoor water park in the country. The concept was simple but revolutionary. If the waterslides could be moved indoors, the Dells tourism season did not have to end when the Wisconsin summer ended. Visitors could come in February. They could come in November. The economics of the resort industry in the Dells flipped overnight. Instead of a frantic 3-month season followed by 9 months of dormancy, hotel operators could now sell rooms 12 months a year by attaching their properties to year-round water attractions. The Wilderness Resort and Treasure Island water parks opened the following year. The Kalahari Resort opened in 2000, inspired by its founder's trip to South Africa, with a 74,000-square-foot indoor water park and an African theme that replaced the Old West frontier motif with something more exotic and contemporary. The money flowing into the Dells during this period was extraordinary. New resorts were being built with construction budgets in the tens of millions. The Kalahari's Pocono Mountains location, which opened in 2015, cost $430 million. Back in Wisconsin Dells, the Strip was being remade block by block, motel by motel, as operators either converted to water park resorts or sold to those who would. And there sat the remains of Fort Dells. Log walls sagging, paths overgrown, the Totem Tower standing empty against the sky. A monument to everything the Dells had been and no longer wished to be. In 1997, what remained of the structures was taken apart and bulldozed. The log buildings were backhoed into rubble and dust. The site was cleared for redevelopment. The frontage along the Parkway became the McDonald's, the Walgreens, the Starbucks. But the back portion of the property, the floodplain along Holbert Creek where the train had run and the steamboat had floated, was left alone. Nature did what nature does to abandoned ground in Wisconsin. Tall grass grew in. Nettles and poison ivy colonized the old pathways. Maple trees and birches sent up saplings through cracks in the pavement. The sandstone bluff that had formed the park's natural backdrop remained, and in its face, the entrance to the Big Bonanza mine remained too, a dark opening in the rock, strewn with old park litter, including an iron safe that had been part of the Frontier display, now toppled on its side in the weeds. Engine number 9, the steam train that had run through Fort Dells for 26 years, was saved. It was restored and moved across the street to what is now Timbavati Wildlife Park, where it continues to carry visitors along a different track. Timbavati itself occupies the site of the former Riverview Park and Water World, another Dells attraction that closed in 2010, yet another casualty of the relentless competitive churn along the Strip. The Wildlife Park, which combines a zoo with the train ride and other amusements, is a different kind of operation than Fort Dells was, but it found a use for engine number 9, which is the closest thing to a physical rescue that anything from the old park received. Of all the things that made Fort Dells what it was, the train is the only one that survived in working form. The Totem Tower was taken down, its steel structure dismantled and hauled away, leaving no trace in the skyline where it had stood for decades. The Robert E. Lee was removed from its channel, and the channel itself slowly filled with silt and vegetation until it was no longer distinguishable from the surrounding floodplain. The stagecoach disappeared. The Black Bart costumes went wherever costumes go when the show is over. Storage, donation, disposal. The suspension bridge, the escape tunnel, the blockhouse exhibits, all gone without physical trace. But engine number 9 kept running, its whistle audible from the parking lot of the Walgreens that sits on the land where its track once lay. In 2003, a group called the Friends of Fort Dells erected a historical marker on the site near the Walgreens on Wisconsin Dells Parkway south of State Highway 13. The marker lists the park's attractions in a single breathless sentence: stagecoach, railroad, paddlewheel steamboat, swinging bridge, blockhouse exhibits, escape tunnel, amphitheater, Indian Isle, frontier homestead and schoolhouse, gold mine, antique car ride, haunted house, children's farm, timber trail, Totem Tower, Black Bart holdup. 16 items, listed without elaboration, as if the names alone would be enough. And for anyone who was there, they are. Each name triggers a specific sensory memory, a sound, a smell, a feeling of motion or surprise. For anyone who was not there, the list is opaque, a catalog of experiences that cannot be reconstructed from their titles. The marker stands at the edge of the Walgreens parking lot, which means that most people who see it are on their way to pick up a prescription or buy sunscreen. It would be easy to walk past without reading it, and most people do. The historical marker is a genre of memory that works differently from a building or a ruin. A building says, "I was here." A ruin says, I was here and now I am not. A historical marker says, something was here, and we want you to know about it, even though there is nothing left to see. The Fort Dells marker attempts this third, most difficult kind of remembering. It asks the viewer to stand in a Walgreens parking lot and imagine a frontier town. There is also a Facebook page created by people who remember the park, where old photographs are shared and stories are traded. Posts from the early 2010s show images of the park's remnants, structures in the early stages of being consumed by vegetation, trails disappearing under brush, artifacts lying where they were left. The comments beneath these photos are almost uniformly written by people in their 50s and 60s recalling childhood visits. The specificity of the memories is striking. Not general warmth, not vague nostalgia, but precise details. The color of a particular building, the position of a particular display, the exact route the stagecoach took around a particular curve. There is a peculiar detail about the remnants of Fort Dells that a researcher discovered as recently as 2025, when he bushwhacked his way into the overgrown back portion of the property. He expected to find nothing. Instead, he found that the floodplain location and the small size of the undeveloped parcel had worked in favor of preserving what was left. Foundation stones still bordered the waterless channel that once carried the Robert E. Lee. A weedy terrace between the channel and the sandstone bluff still traced the route of the Kilbourne and Western Railroad. The Big Bonanza mine survived as a cave littered with old park debris, including that iron safe with its door detached, lying on the ground next to a moss-covered shoe. And on a patch of cracked pavement near where the children's farm had been, 2 sets of red wagon wheels rested in the shade of maple trees that had grown up through what was once open ground. Those wagon wheels. They were part of the park's decorative landscape, the kind of detail that frontier-themed attractions placed at every turn, a visual cue that said, this is the Old West, this is the past, this is somewhere other than where you actually are. When the park was operating, the wagon wheels were stage props, scenery, barely noticed by visitors who were busy watching Black Bart or waiting in line for the Totem Tower. They served the theme. They were functional in the same way that a potted plant in a hotel lobby is functional. They completed a picture. Nobody thought about them twice. Now they sit in shade cast by trees that did not exist when the park was open, on pavement that is cracking apart under the pressure of roots and frost, and 30 years of neglect. The wheels have not moved. They were not worth salvaging when the front of the property was bulldozed. They were not interesting enough to steal. They were too heavy to be carried away by weather. So they stayed, and they became, by accident, the most enduring physical remnant of 26 years of frontier fantasy. The log cabin McDonald's on the Parkway is an homage to the old park, but it is a new building serving a new purpose. The historical marker is a deliberate act of remembrance, a text placed intentionally. The wagon wheels are neither. They are simply what was left behind. The question of why Fort Dells closed tends to produce a single answer. The waterparks killed it. And this is substantially true. The rise of water-based attractions in the late 1970s and 1980s fundamentally changed what tourists came to Wisconsin Dells to do, and Fort Dells was not equipped to compete in the new landscape. But the story is more complicated than that, and the complications matter. The frontier theme was already losing cultural relevance before the first waterslide went in. The park's physical plant was aging, and the maintenance costs of structures like the Totem Tower were significant. The passive, walk-through model of entertainment was giving way to a more active, sensation-driven model across the entire amusement industry, not just in the Dells. And the specific economics of an 11-acre park in an area where land was becoming increasingly valuable made it difficult to justify keeping the operation going when the same property could generate more revenue as commercial real estate. What happened to Fort Dells happened, in one form or another, to dozens of similar attractions across the country during the same period. Storybook Gardens, the fairy tale walk-through park just down the road, held on longer. It did not close until 2010, after more than half a century of operation, but it too was eventually overtaken by the same forces. By the end, its founder, Melvin Flath's granddaughter's family was running the duck boat operation while struggling to keep the garden park viable in a market that had moved far beyond fairy tale figurines and flower beds. The last operator of Storybook Gardens, Mark Schobel, who leased and ran the park for its final 7 seasons, acknowledged that the classic fairy tale attraction could not compete with the new generation of attractions and their changing demographics. Biblical Gardens, which had opened nearby in 1962, closed and was redeveloped as Canyon Creek condominiums. The Enchanted Forest, Prehistoric Land, Pioneer Village, all of them eventually gave way. The Wonder Spot, a gravity-defying slanty shanty that had been a Dells attraction for decades, eventually closed as well. The model of the small, themed, walk-through attraction, built for the pace of families who had all day and nowhere else to be, turned out to be a model that belonged to a specific era of American tourism. The era of the road trip, the station wagon, the motel with the kidney-shaped pool. When that era ended, the attractions ended with it. Melvin Flath himself is an interesting figure to consider alongside the unknown operators of Fort Dells. Flath was the man who brought the duck boats to Wisconsin Dells in 1946, using surplus World War II amphibious vehicles, and later built Storybook Gardens, and a miniature golf course and a drive-in theater. He understood the Dells tourist market as well as anyone, and he built attractions that matched the temper of their times. His grandson eventually added jet boat rides and zip-line courses behind Storybook Gardens, reinventing the family business for a new era. The people who built Fort Dells did not have that generational continuity, or at least did not exercise it visibly. The park appears to have been operated as a business rather than a family legacy, which may help explain why it was easier to close, easier to rebrand as Dells Crossroads, and ultimately easier to bulldoze. There was no name on the gate that someone felt compelled to preserve. But Fort Dells was the first to go among the major Dells attractions, or at least the most prominent to go, and its closure in 1985 can be understood as the moment when Wisconsin Dells crossed from one identity to another. Before 1985, the Dells was a place organized around natural scenery, boat tours, and themed walk-through attractions, a summer destination that operated at a pace determined by walking speed and seasonal weather. After 1985, it was on its way to becoming the water park capital of the world, a title it would claim with increasing confidence through the 1990s and 2000s as the indoor water park resorts multiplied and the annual visitor count climbed into the millions. The transformation was not just commercial but atmospheric. The old Dells had been a place of wood and stone and water, its attractions built close to the ground, scaled to the human body, integrated into the landscape. The new Dells was a place of fiberglass and chlorine and climate control, its attractions housed in buildings the size of aircraft hangars engineered for maximum throughput, designed to be experienced in bathing suits regardless of the temperature outside. Fort Dells did not simply close because it could not compete. It closed because the entire premise of what a vacation in Wisconsin Dells was supposed to be had changed underneath it. The park was designed for visitors who wanted to spend a day walking through a frontier town. The visitors who replaced them wanted to spend a day hurtling down waterslides. These are not the same people, even if they come from the same families and drive the same highways. The change was generational, and it was permanent, and no amount of reinvention, not Dells Crossroads, not circus acts, not anything that could be done on 11 acres of floodplain, could have reversed it. There is one more thing about the Totem Tower that is worth knowing. At 335 feet, it was tall enough to be seen from the highway, from the river, from the parking lots of competing attractions. For years, it was the tallest structure in the Dells, a visual anchor for the entire tourist corridor. When you asked someone how to find Fort Dells, the answer was often just, look for the tower. After the park closed, the tower stood empty for years before it was dismantled. During that time, it served as a kind of accidental monument, a vertical marker for a place that no longer existed at its base. Visitors who remembered the park from their childhood would drive past and see the tower still standing above the trees, and for a moment the park was still there, not open, not operating, but present, declared by that one visible structure. When the tower finally came down, there was nothing left above the tree line to say that Fort Dells had ever been there at all. The Dells kept growing after 1985 in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the families who visited Fort Dells in 1965 or 1972. Tourism in the area now generates more than $1 billion in direct spending each year. The indoor water park resorts, Wilderness, Kalahari, Great Wolf Lodge, Chula Vista, Mount Olympus, operate year-round, offering hundreds of thousands of square feet of climate-controlled water attractions that make the old seasonal parks seem impossibly quaint. The go-kart tracks have become multi-level affairs with elevated bridges and banked turns. Roller coasters arrived in the 1990s when the Lascaris family added the Cyclops coaster to their Big Chief operation in 1995. The Lascaris story, in its own way, is a mirror image of the Fort Dells story. Demetrios Lascaris was a Greek immigrant who had operated restaurants in Chicago before moving his family to Wisconsin Dells in 1970 to open a hot dog stand, which they named Big Chief after a statue purchased from a trade show. The hot dog stand nearly failed. The family found $700 in savings inside a sock, which they invested in a three-wheeler dirt track. From that desperate improvisation, they built the go-kart operation that eventually became Big Chief Karts and Coasters and then Mount Olympus Water and Theme Park, one of the largest combined water and theme parks in the Dells. The Cyclops coaster cost $400,000, and attendance jumped 45% the year it opened. They added Pegasus in 1996, Zeus in 1997. By the time they were done, the family that had arrived with a failing hot dog stand controlled over 150 acres of prime tourist real estate. The Lascaris family succeeded in part by doing what Fort Dells could not or would not do. They kept changing. They started with go-karts and added coasters. They added water attractions. They bought neighboring properties and absorbed them. They renamed and rebranded. They adjusted their offerings to match what visitors wanted in each successive decade. Fort Dells, by contrast, was defined by a single vision, the frontier, and when that vision lost its audience, the park had nothing to pivot to. The Strip, which in the 1960s had been a modest corridor of motels and souvenir shops, became a dense commercial canyon of competing attractions, each one louder and more colorful than the last. In all of this growth, the physical footprint of Fort Dells shrank to almost nothing. The front of the property became chain retail. The log cabin McDonald's opened in 2002, its timber exterior a conscious nod to the park that had occupied the same ground. The Walgreens went in beside it. A Starbucks followed. The address of the old park, 775 Wisconsin Dells Parkway, now belongs to the McDonald's, and the irony of a fast food restaurant inheriting the address of a place that once asked visitors to slow down and imagine themselves in 1870 is not lost on anyone who pays attention. The back of the property became woods. The historical marker stood quietly at the edge of the parking lot. Engine number 9 chugged along at Timbavati across the street, carrying a new generation of visitors who had no idea they were riding a piece of Fort Dells. And the wagon wheels sat in the shade of the maples, their red paint fading, their iron rims rusting in the Wisconsin weather, waiting for someone to either move them or forget them entirely. Parsons Indian Trading Post, which had been operating on the Strip since 1919, long before Fort Dells or the water parks or any of the modern attractions existed, was still open as recently as 2020, selling Native American souvenirs and artifacts. Its owners noted that business had been declining for years. The pandemic added to the worry. The trading post was a relic of a Dells that had existed before the theme parks, before the motels, before the Strip itself was paved. It had outlived Fort Dells, outlived Storybook Gardens, outlived Biblical Gardens, and continued to stand as a reminder that the history of Wisconsin Dells is measured not in decades but in layers. Each generation of attractions built on top of the one that came before, each one eventually displaced by the next. Visitors from the Fort Dells era, many of whom are now grandparents, still mention the park when they come back to the Dells with their families. They describe it to their grandchildren with a specificity that surprises even them. The sound of the blank gunshots during the Black Bart holdup, the smell of the animals at the children's farm, the slow creak of the suspension bridge, the way the Totem Tower swayed slightly at the top on windy days. These are not the memories of people who had a good time at an amusement park. They are the memories of people who were, for a few hours, inside a story, and who have carried the details of that story forward for decades without quite knowing why. One visitor from the 1970s, recounting a trip taken as a child, described the moment the stagecoach rounded a bend and came face to face with Black Bart blocking the path, his hat pulled low, his voice loud enough to hear from 3 rows back. The child did not know it was a show. For a few seconds, the robbery was real, and the fear was real, and the relief when the sheriff appeared was real. 50 years later, the details had not faded. The color of the hat, the sound of the horse, the dust rising from the path. Another former visitor remembered a different kind of moment altogether. It was late in the afternoon on one of the park's final seasons. She wasn't sure if it was 1983 or 1984, and the park was nearly empty. She walked the Timber Trail nature path with her father, the two of them alone among the trees, the sounds of the park distant and muffled. They came to the end of the trail and looked out over the creek, and her father told her he had come to Fort Dells as a boy with his own parents 20 years before. He pointed to where the train tracks ran and told her about riding engine number 9 when the paint on the buildings was fresh and the stockade walls looked new. She was 10 years old and did not think much of it at the time. It was only after the park closed that the walk took on the quality of a farewell. 2 generations of the same family passing through the same 11 acres, separated by 2 decades, neither quite aware of what the park meant until it was gone. These are the kinds of memories that small parks produce, and large ones sometimes don't, because they are formed at close range, in spaces where the performance reaches the audience without amplification, without screens, without mediation. Fort Dells was not a great park by the standards of the theme park industry. It did not have the budget of Disney or the engineering of Six Flags. Its rides were slow, its grounds were modest, its shows were performed by local actors in rented costumes. But it operated at a human scale, and the experiences it produced were proportionate to that scale, intimate, immediate, and apparently indelible. The Dells Fargo stagecoach no longer exists. The Robert E. Lee is gone. Indian Isle is a patch of floodplain. The Frontier homestead and schoolhouse are foundations in the weeds. The amphitheater, where live shows played to summer crowds, is overgrown and silent. The gold mine is a dark cavity in the sandstone, scattered with debris, its iron safe lying open and empty on the ground outside. Even the suspension bridge, which was nothing more than cables and planks stretched over a modest gap, has vanished completely, leaving no trace that it ever carried the weight of nervous visitors stepping carefully from one side to the other. The only sounds in that back portion of the property now are the sounds that were always there underneath the park's noise: the creek moving over stones, birds in the maples, wind through the tall grass. Holbert Creek, which was there before the park and will be there after the last foundation stone crumbles, runs along the same course it always has, indifferent to what was built beside it and what was taken away. Engine number 9 still runs. Across the street, at Timbavati, it follows a track through a wildlife park that has nothing to do with the frontier, nothing to do with Black Bart or stagecoach robberies or gold mines. The children who ride it have their own reasons for being excited: the animals, the motion, the simple pleasure of riding a train. They do not know that the engine once pulled its cars past a sandstone bluff where a man in a black hat pretended to rob them, that the whistle they hear echoed off log buildings that no longer exist, that the same wheels turning beneath them turned through the summers of 1959 and 1966 and 1972 and 1985, carrying passengers who were, in those moments, somewhere else entirely. The wagon wheels in the shade of the maples have not been painted in decades. The red has faded to a rust that is nearly the same color as the iron rims, so that from a few feet away the wood and the metal seem to be the same material, weathered into the same state. The maple branches above them drop leaves in the fall and shade them in the summer. In winter, snow buries them. In spring they reappear, a little more worn, a little more settled into the broken pavement. They are not a monument and they are not a ruin. They are an object that outlasted its context, still present, still exactly where it was placed, still waiting for a park that closed a long time ago and is not coming back.